Evan had always been my constant. From the moment we could walk, we were side by side, running through the fields behind my family's estate, building forts in the old barn, whispering secrets under the giant oak tree that became ours. No matter how suffocating my world of rules and expectations felt, Evan was my escape. He had this way of making everything feel lighter, as if nothing, not wealth, not status, not my mother's disapproval, could touch us. But even as children, we both knew the truth. Some loves were never meant to last. His family barely scraped by, his father breaking his back at the docks, his mother working odd jobs just to put food on the table. My world was nothing like his. I lived in grand halls, wore private school uniforms, and attended dinners where I was taught to smile but never speak out of turn. My mother, Eleanor Whitmore, made sure I understood that love was a privilege, something reserved for those who deserved it. And in her eyes, Evan would never be enough. The whispers started early. Servants spoke in hushed tones, dinner guests stole glances when Evan and I were in the same room. My mother never hid her disdain. "He will never be enough for you, Linda," she would say, her voice sharp as cut glass. "Marrying him would be like throwing your life away." I told myself she was wrong. That love could conquer anything. That one day I would prove her wrong. But deep down, I was afraid. Afraid that she saw something I refused to admit. And then, one night, everything changed. I was sitting on the staircase, hidden in the shadows, when I heard her voice. Cold, unforgiving, final. "She will marry Trevor Sinclair. That boy, Evan, he will be dealt with." My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just about forcing me into a marriage. My mother was planning to erase Evan from my life entirely, and in that moment, I knew. I had to act before it was too late. I wanted to believe she was bluffing, that my mother's threats were nothing more than empty words meant to scare me into obedience. But deep down, I knew better. Eleanor Whitmore never made empty threats. If she said Evan would be dealt with, she already had a plan in motion, and that terrified me. That night, I snuck out. The mansion was quiet, the hallways dimly lit by the flickering glow of antique sconces. I had done this before, countless times, slipping past the grand staircase, past my mother's study where she sat sipping brandy and scheming about my future. But this time felt different. This time I wasn't just sneaking out to meet Evan. I was running toward the only person who could remind me that I still had a choice. He was waiting for me by the old oak tree, just like he always did. His back was turned when I arrived, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. He looked up at the sound of my footsteps, and for a second, everything else disappeared. The world, the expectations, the fear, it all faded in the warmth of his gaze. "I heard her," I whispered, my voice trembling. "She's going to make sure we can never be together." Evan's expression darkened, but he didn't seem surprised. He reached for my hand, his fingers rough and calloused against mine. "She was never going to let us be, Linda," he murmured. "We've been fooling ourselves." I shook my head, gripping his hand tighter. "No, I won't let her win." But even as I said it, the weight of my mother's influence loomed over me like a storm I couldn't outrun. Evan sighed, his thumb tracing circles over my knuckles, a habit he'd had since we were kids. "Linda, she owns everything. She controls everything. Do you really think we can fight her and win?" His words stung, not because they weren't true, but because he had already accepted what I refused to. My mother's power stretched far beyond our town. Her influence was woven into politics, business, society. She didn't just win battles. She erased any trace that they had ever existed. And yet, looking at Evan, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let her erase us. "I don't care," I said, my voice firm despite the fear clawing at my chest. "I won't let her decide my life for me." Evan gave me a sad smile, the kind that said he wanted to believe me but couldn't. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew one thing. If my mother was going to force me into a future without Evan, I had to be smarter. I had to be patient. Because if there was one lesson Eleanor Whitmore had taught me, it was this. Power wasn't always about strength. Sometimes the deadliest weapon was time. I thought I had time. I thought if I played along, if I was careful, I could find a way to be with Evan without setting off my mother's wrath. But I was wrong. She didn't wait. She didn't hesitate. Less than a week after I overheard her plans, she summoned me to the parlor, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction as she slid an invitation across the polished marble table. "Your engagement party," she announced, her voice dripping with finality. "It will be next Saturday." The words crashed over me like a wave, knocking the air from my lungs. I stared at the elegant gold lettering, the intertwined names, Linda Whitmore and Trevor Sinclair, and for the first time, I understood. My mother hadn't just arranged this marriage. She had orchestrated it down to the finest detail, ensuring that there was no room for defiance. "I won't do this," I said, though my voice was barely a whisper. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look up from the invitation. "You will," she replied simply. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure that boy never works a day in his life. His parents will lose their home, his future, his family, everything. Gone." Her voice was calm, smooth, as if she were discussing the weather. But I felt it, the ice beneath her words, the quiet certainty that she meant every single syllable. I wanted to scream. To throw that invitation in her face and tell her that nothing, no threat, no scheme, no amount of control, would make me marry a man I didn't love. But the image of Evan, of his mother scrubbing floors just to make ends meet, of his father breaking his back at the docks, stopped me cold. She would do it. She would ruin them, and she would never lose a second of sleep over it. So I swallowed my rage. I forced my trembling hands to still and lifted my chin. "Fine," I said, meeting her gaze with all the strength I had left. "I'll do it." A victorious smile curled at her lips. Good girl. She thought she had won. That I would simply accept my fate, put on the dress, play the perfect daughter, the perfect fiancée. She didn't see what was behind my silence, didn't hear the war raging inside me. I wasn't surrendering. I was waiting, planning. Because if she wanted me to be the daughter she had trained me to be, poised, composed, strategic, then I would use every lesson she had ever taught me against her. The days blurred into a carefully orchestrated routine, engagement dress fittings, floral arrangements, guest lists filled with names I neither knew nor cared about. I smiled when I was expected to, nodded when spoken to, and let my mother believe I was the obedient daughter she had always wanted. But inside, I was a storm waiting to break. Trevor Sinclair was as polished as they came, wealthy, powerful, exactly the kind of man my mother deemed worthy. He played his part well, offering me his arm at dinners, exchanging pleasantries about our future, all while knowing this arrangement had nothing to do with love. I wondered if he cared, if he saw me as anything more than a well-bred accessory to his family's legacy. One evening, as I sat by the grand piano in our parlor, my mother glided in, a glass of wine in hand. "You're making the right choice, Linda," she said, her voice soft, almost warm. "In time, you'll see that love is a luxury for those who can afford to be foolish." I pressed my fingers against the keys, letting the dissonant notes fill the silence between us. "Is that what you tell yourself?" I asked, my voice even. "That you never loved my father?" For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. A shadow, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Your father was useful," she said, taking a slow sip of her wine. "But love makes people weak." I held her gaze, my heart pounding. She had no idea. No idea that her lessons in control, in patience, in strategy had created something she could no longer contain. The day arrived wrapped in perfection. The estate was transformed into a spectacle of wealth, white roses cascading from the marble columns, crystal chandeliers reflecting the golden glow of the afternoon sun. Guests in tailored suits and designer gowns sipped champagne, whispering about the grandeur of the Whitmore-Sinclair union. Every detail was meticulously curated, every moment crafted for appearances. I stood in front of the mirror, encased in layers of silk and lace, my mother's final masterpiece. The weight of the gown pressed against my ribs, but it wasn't nearly as suffocating as the future she had tried to carve out for me. Behind me, she adjusted the veil, her expression unreadable. "You look exactly as you should," she murmured, the closest thing to approval I would ever receive. I met her gaze in the mirror, my pulse steady, my breathing even. "I know," I said, and for the first time I wasn't lying, because she thought today was her victory. She thought I had been broken, molded into the daughter she had always wanted. But what she didn't realize, what no one in that room had even begun to suspect, was that today wasn't the day she won. Today was the day I burned it all down. The music swelled as I stepped into the grand hall, every eye turning toward me. Rows of guests whispered behind gloved hands, their smiles polished, their approval conditioned. Trevor stood at the altar, poised, handsome, a man born into a world where love was a formality, not a necessity. His gaze met mine, unreadable, uninterested. He wasn't nervous. This wasn't about us. It was about power, about empire building. But I wasn't thinking about Trevor. I was thinking about Evan, about the last time I saw him, the anger in his voice, the helplessness in his grip when he pulled me aside and begged, "Tell me this isn't real. Tell me you're not actually going to marry him." I had cupped his face in my hands, traced the scar along his jawline with my thumb, and whispered the only thing that mattered. "Trust me." The heavy doors shut behind me, sealing the fate my mother thought she had written for me. I walked the aisle with slow, deliberate steps, past the chandeliers, past the cold, gleaming faces that had judged me since childhood. My mother stood at the front, her spine straight, her eyes glistening with pride. To her, I was finally where I belonged. I smiled, because she had no idea what was coming. I reached the altar, my heartbeat steady, my hands impossibly still. Trevor extended his arm, the weight of expectation heavy between us. The officiant cleared his throat, his voice echoing through the grand hall, carrying words that meant nothing to me. "We are gathered here today." I felt my mother's gaze burning into me, watching for any sign of hesitation. She thought she had broken me, thought she had stripped away my choices, my will. She thought today was hers. "Do you, Linda Whitmore, take Trevor Sinclair to be your lawfully wedded husband?" I turned to Trevor, meeting his cool, detached stare. Then I smiled. "No." The word rippled through the room like a stone dropped into still water. A gasp, a murmur, a shifting unease. And then, chaos. My mother's face twisted, a flash of something raw and uncontained behind her mask of control. Trevor tensed beside me, confusion flickering in his otherwise composed features. But I wasn't done. Not yet. With practiced grace, I reached beneath the folds of my gown and pulled out a thick, neatly bound stack of papers. The weight of it felt electric in my hands. "Because I'm already married," I announced, my voice steady, clear. I turned toward my mother, savoring the horror in her expression. To Evan. The silence that followed was deafening. The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the scraping of chairs as guests turned to one another, seeking confirmation that they had heard correctly. Trevor stiffened beside me, his hands curling into fists. But I didn't look at him. I only watched her. My mother's face drained of color, her lips parting, but no words came. It was a rare moment, Eleanor Whitmore, speechless. With measured precision, I lifted the legal documents for all to see. "A legally binding marriage certificate," I said, my voice carrying over the din. "Signed, sealed, irreversible." Trevor took a sharp breath, stepping back as if I had struck him. His family, seated in the front row, wore expressions ranging from confusion to pure disgust. I could already see the calculations in their eyes. How quickly could they sever ties? How badly had this deal gone sour? But I wasn't finished. I turned to my mother. "You spent years building this empire," I said, keeping my tone smooth, almost casual. "Manipulating, controlling, deciding the fate of everyone around you." I took a step closer, my grip tightening on the papers. But you should have been more careful with your secrets. A flicker of something, fear. She masked it quickly, straightening her spine. Linda, enough. Her voice was low, warning, the last shred of control she could cling to. I smiled. And then, with deliberate ease, I reached for the second stack of documents hidden beneath the first. I held up the second stack of papers, letting the weight of them sink in before I spoke. For years, you've hidden behind wealth and power, I said, my voice unwavering. You've built this family's fortune on more than just ambition, but let's tell the truth, shall we? I turned to the guests, the society elite who had gathered to celebrate what was supposed to be my mother's greatest triumph. The Whitmore name isn't built on legacy, it's built on corruption. I tossed the first page onto the altar, letting the crisp paper flutter to the floor. Fraud. Another page. Money laundering. A third. Tax evasion, bribery, illegal business dealings. A wave of horrified whispers spread across the hall. The Sinclairs shifted uncomfortably, already putting distance between themselves and my mother. Eleanor's face remained eerily composed, but I saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her nails pressed into the silk of her dress. You think you can slander me? She hissed, her voice low, dangerous. I don't need to, I replied, meeting her eyes with steady defiance. I have proof. And then, I turned toward the back of the room, toward the man who had been waiting for this moment. A government official, seated quietly among the guests, his expression unreadable. He had suspected my mother for years but never had the evidence to bring her down. Until now. I gave him a small nod, and in return he reached into his pocket. The rustle of an official-looking envelope sent a fresh wave of panic through the crowd. My mother's breath hitched. For the first time in my life, I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen before. Panic. And that was when I knew. I had won. A hush fell over the room as the government official rose from his seat, his footsteps slow, deliberate. He didn't need to speak. The weight of the envelope in his hand said enough. My mother's kingdom, built on illusion and fear, was crumbling before her eyes. You have no idea what you've done, she whispered, her voice low, shaking. I tilted my head, letting her words settle. No, Mother. You have no idea what I'm capable of. The official reached the front of the room, meeting my gaze with quiet understanding before turning to the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice calm but firm. These documents, along with prior investigations, are sufficient to open formal proceedings against the Whitmore family. He glanced at my mother. We will, of course, allow for due process. But in the meantime, your assets are being frozen as we speak, I finished for him, watching the realization strike her like a physical blow. A gasp rippled through the guests. Trevor's father was already rising, his face twisted in barely concealed disgust. This arrangement is over, he declared, stepping away as if even standing near my mother would taint him. Trevor followed suit, muttering something under his breath before storming out of the room. I turned back to Eleanor. The proud, untouchable woman who had dictated my life was now a portrait of rage and ruin. You played God for too long, I said softly, and now you're finally facing judgment. The doors at the far end of the hall burst open, uniformed officers moving with practiced efficiency. My mother's lips parted, perhaps to fight, perhaps to plead. But it was too late. This was the end, and I had written it myself. I stood motionless as the officers closed in, their voices calm but firm. My mother's hands clenched at her sides, her jaw tight, her composure hanging by a thread. You think this is over? She hissed, her voice so low only I could hear. You think you've won? I leaned in slightly, meeting her gaze, unflinching. No, Mother, I whispered. I know I have. The moment the first officer stepped forward, touching her arm, something inside her snapped. Don't you dare touch me, she spat, jerking away. But even her rage couldn't stop what was coming. The cuffs clicked around her wrists, a sound so final it sent a shiver through the room. The mighty Eleanor Whitmore, who had dictated every move I made, was now powerless in the hands of the law. I didn't look away as they escorted her out, past the stunned guests, past the reporters who had somehow already caught wind of the scandal. I wanted her to see it, how quickly the people she once controlled turned away, how easily power could slip through greedy fingers. As she was led through the doors, she turned back, locking eyes with me one last time, and in that final moment, I saw something that surprised me. Not fury, not defiance, fear. The moment she was gone, the air in the grand hall shifted. The guests who had once whispered about my perfect wedding now murmured about scandal, disgrace, ruin. I watched as former allies distanced themselves, as Trevor's parents exited without so much as a glance in my direction. Good. Let them leave. Let them pretend they never stood beside my mother, never benefited from her corruption. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of years of control lift from my shoulders. And then, as if the world had been holding its breath along with me, a hand touched mine. Warm, familiar. I turned, and there he was. Evan. His eyes searched mine, cautious, hesitant. "You really did it," he murmured, his voice unreadable. I nodded. "I told you to trust me." He let out a shaky breath, a mixture of disbelief and something else, something closer to admiration. And then, without another word, he pulled me into his arms. The silk of my wedding dress crumpled between us, but I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about appearances. For the first time, I was free. We didn't stay. There was nothing left for me in that house, in that world. By the time night fell, I had packed what little I wanted to keep. Things my mother hadn't chosen for me, things that felt real. A photo of my father, an old book with notes scribbled in the margins, a locket Evan had given me when we were kids. The rest? It could rot along with my mother's empire. Evan and I drove in silence for miles, the estate disappearing behind us, swallowed by the darkness. The further we got, the lighter I felt. No more grand halls filled with empty people. No more suffocating expectations. No more her. At a gas station on the edge of town, Evan finally spoke. "Where do we go now?" I stared at the map in my hands, tracing roads I'd never been allowed to take. The future stretched wide open before me, uncertain and unplanned. For the first time in my life, I had no answers, and I had never felt more alive. I folded the map, looking at Evan with a slow, knowing smile. Anywhere but back. With that, he started the engine, and we disappeared into the night, finally free, finally ourselves.